we'll pick up with the 10th plague and look at Passover. That's my plan. And who knows, by Sunday night we could be in Song of Solomon. But for now, my plan is to do that. As this is a big, big moment in biblical history. All right, Exodus 7. And this, of course, we're looking at the 10. We're really going to look at the first 9 plagues. And there's actually a reason why we're going to cut it off there, as we'll see. Because the 10th one is unique. And I'll show you why we believe that. And it is one of the most recognizable stories in the Bible. When I was younger, maybe middle schooler, maybe a little younger, we took a church trip to watch the Prince of Egypt movie, the animated movie. Excellent. Not perfect, but it's really good. They don't have the scene where, Zipporah grabs a flint knife. They left that part out. But still, I remember vividly seeing the 10 plague scene and how awesome that was. We won't have time, but years ago when we went through the story of Exodus, we showed a documentary on a Sunday night called Patterns of Evidence. The first one looks at the 10 plagues and the Exodus in general, and really shows how historically there is strong evidence that the 10 plagues actually happened. We have an Egyptian in his diary describing essentially the 10 plagues. Now, he doesn't say, and the Lord calls darkness over the earth. He doesn't talk like that. He's saying there are stones flying out of the sky, right? The city's on fire. The waters turn to blood. I mean, he describes essentially the 10 plagues. And I don't want to get distracted by all that. We've done that in the past. But maybe in another time we can look at some of that. So let me just in terms of what the 10 plagues are for, there are 3 things to note. The first is that they are an act of decreation. Decreation. Now, this is similar to Noah's Ark, where, remember, we talked about as the waters flooded the earth, it's an act of decreation. It's a theological term, which is a cosmic event to where God uses the language of creation, yet it's a decreation act. And then out of the flood comes another act of creation. I've shown that 1,000 times. This is similar to that. So what we're looking for is language in the text that points us back to creation. And so what we're going to see in the end is that God is not just the God of destruction, he's the God of construction. And that is significant. These are also acts of judgment against both empire and injustice. So if you speak from a broad biblical perspective, Genesis, Revelation, the Bible is not a fan of empires. Egypt, Babylon, the Philistines, the Assyrians, Rome, right? And Revelation is one of the most politically driven books of the Bible because of what it says about empire. You could say the same thing about Exodus. Here God chooses to side with the plight of the oppressed against an empire that would oppress them. And that is significant. And that was why that when it came to the Babylonians, the return to Jerusalem was called a new Exodus. Because of God judging empires. And also the inadequacy of idolatry. When we went through Exodus years ago, I emphasized this part of the story. We won't be able to do it as much tonight. But that's really what it is you have going on here. So we're looking for acts of decreation, the language of decreation. What does God's judgment look like upon the nations or upon empire? And what does this say about idolatry? So let's start with the confrontation here in verses 1 to 3. Moses, of course, has been sent by God. His son has been circumcised very recently. And he is pleading the case of enslaved Israel. Now remember that we left off the story of Joseph last week. The Israelites are in the land of Goshen. And the word Goshen shares the letters with garden. And so Genesis ends with us thinking that the Garden of Eden has been moved. It's no longer in the Promised Land. It's now in Egypt, where there's a major river runs right through it. And here are the people of Israel, the people of God, the seed of the woman, who are enjoying the garden, or they're enjoying Goshen, and they are fruitful, they are multiplying. Exodus 1 starts with, they are fruitful and multiplying, and they filled the garden. However, we see that they're not in the garden, they're actually in the wilderness. And the longing of Israel is to go to the promised land. And so this garden has become a type of wilderness. And we're going to have to do a lot of skipping here and there, but we'll start in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you like God. The Pharaoh will come to that in a second. And your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of this land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh. Remember the scene there at the burning bush. I am the Lord. When I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. So a couple of things to know here. One is the big part that everybody wants to know, especially whenever you've got a little bit of Bible under your belt, right? There's always questions that come up, right? In nearly 20 years of vocational ministry, a couple questions people ask. One is, where did Cain get his wife? That's always the first one. You get a little Bible under your belt, you start thinking about the biblical story. Well, where did Cain get that wife, right? Another question people get is, we wrestle with God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Now, I'm not going to answer all your questions today, because you think about it too much, you'll find yourself under the bed reciting the Greek alphabet backwards with your thumb in your mouth in the fetal position, right? But let me at least point this out to you. This phrase, it is connected to the 10 plagues, and it says so as much, right? I will stretch out my hand, and Pharaoh will not listen to you. Why? Because I will harden his heart. But you'll notice here, in general, right, the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh hardens his own hearts. He would not listen to Pharaoh. He would not listen to Moses because he hardened his heart. The last 5, again, in general, to simplify it, God actively hardens his heart. Now, which is it? Right? I mean, that's a real riddle. I remember, being a teenager, first read that, I was like, well, that's weird. Why would God harden his heart? Because we're afraid if God hardened his heart, can he harden ours? And who does God think he is? Right? That's the way we Americans approach these texts. And yet, it's more ambiguous than that, isn't it? You have both Pharaoh harden his own heart and God actively harden his own heart. Both are true simultaneously. Now, I am not going to be able to answer all your questions about the sovereignty of God and the agency of man. Let me just say that the Bible affirms both. God is absolutely in control and has the right to do whatever it is God wants to do. The king is in the hand of God, and he turns it whichever way he wants. Every throw of the dice, I think Proverbs tells us, God controls where it lands, right? This is Scripture is very clear about the sovereign care of God over the affairs of the world, including human affairs. At the same time, humans are accountable, and we do believe in human agency. I like that term better than freedom, because that term can get quite abused. So what can we do for this? Well, we need to know, first of all, that Pharaoh hardened his heart is an active choice that Pharaoh makes. And that is true. And what you get is people want to emphasize one over the other. God's active hardening or Pharaoh's active hardening. But if you want to be biblically sound, you have to emphasize both, because both are true. And I do not think that we have to rationalize and put together everything in a cute little bow. The Bible wants us to wrestle with these questions. Let me see if I can give you an example in a different context. Acts chapter 2. This is Peter preaching on the day of Pentecost. This Jesus delivered up according to what? Pilate? Pharaoh? Caesar? The Sanhedrin? No. The definite plan and foreknowledge of God. Notice, what he is not saying is, well, God knew this was going to happen. No, this was God's plan, and God caused it to happen. It was God's will, it was God's work for Jesus to die upon a cross. I think we should agree with that, right? I mean, that's not anything controversial. Because Jesus says throughout John's gospel, remember the first miracle, Mary comes to Jesus and says, hey, I need you to fix this. And he says, it's not my hour. Later he says, still not my hour. And then he says, the hour is coming. And he says, the hour has come. This is why I'm here. And I will obey all that the Lord has called me to do, my Father. So it's very clear that Christ was predestined, if you want to use that word. Christ was called by God under his sovereign care to die upon a cross. That's good news. That is good news. But then Peter will turn around and say, you crucified him. Well, which is it? Right? Was Jesus crucified because of the sovereign act of God? Yes. Was Jesus crucified because of the evil of man's heart that put the nails in his wrist and condemned him? Yes. How do you reconcile those? To quote Spurgeon, you don't reconcile friends. Right? The Bible allows this sort of act. You could do the same thing with Judas. Right? It was prophesied that Judas would do that. At the same time, Judas freely made that choice. Jesus says the same thing about Pilate. Don't you see that God raised you for this very moment? At the same time, Pilate made the wrong choice, thinking he was somehow innocent of Jesus' blood, yet he's not. We see this throughout the Bible all the time. God will raise up Cyrus, but he will condemn evil kings just as quickly. Right? And so we see this tension throughout the Bible. And we need to allow it to be a tension without thinking that we have to fix it. Okay? Well, the story goes on. Verse 8, then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff, cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Notice, God said he was going to do it. Now Pharaoh has done his own heart. Which is it? Yes, both are true. Now, this scene about the serpent, I always loved growing up. I just thought it was cool. Now, I didn't want to have a stick that did that, but I'm glad Moses had a stick that did that, right? Now, right away, with all of our reading of Genesis, your antenna should be going off, right? Because the story of Exodus makes constant references to the creation-fall narrative. Why? Because the plagues are an act of decreation. And what comes out of decreation is a new creation, a new kingdom, a retelling of the Genesis story. So this word serpent should stick out to you. Because we've read about a serpent before, one that enters into the garden. This is not that word. I just assumed it was, and then I did a little bit of research. It's not. But it does show up in the creation story. Not in Genesis 3, about the crafty serpents. Genesis 1, and you'll never guess where it is. It's right there. You've seen it your whole life, and you just overlooked it. Genesis 1:21, and God created great whales. That's the King James. If you have New American Standard Bible, I think this is true. Another translation, it'll say, and God created the sea monsters, the sea creatures, the monsters of the deep. And every living creature that moves, which the waters bring forth abundantly. Now remember that this is an ancient Near Eastern document we are reading in the Bible. See, now you're looking it up. See, that's the whole point, right? And you're like, they're whales, right? Swallow Jonah. No, you're missing the point. Remember, at this time, the ancients believed, in ancient Near Eastern culture, pagan culture, is that the world was chaotic, right? And so not everything could be tamed. And so kings were the descendants of gods, but you had a chaotic world. And it was their way of setting themselves apart from other kingdoms, right? We come from the gods, you come from the dust, or something like that. And so they would war over their creation stories. And when you get the sea monsters and the dragons and all this sort of stuff, I'll show you some dragons here in a second, the ancients would say they were untamable. Moses comes and writes the creation story, and right from the beginning he says, God created the sea monsters. And he said, you'll stay here and not go anywhere else. God was Lord over the monsters. You can translate this dragons. I know you're thinking, preacher, you've lost your mind. But I'm willing to bet you've read enough of your Bible that you've come across dragons. In fact, you lovers of Revelation, where does the red dragon come from? John didn't make that up. You could do Leviathan or Behemoth, particularly Leviathan. There are land dragons. There are sea dragons in the Old Testament. These dragons were common throughout. Dragons have always been common throughout. They're still common today. Watch The Hobbit, right? The Hobbit was inspired by Beowulf, among other things, right? In fact, really two stories. Beowulf, where the dragon doesn't talk, but it's the story of stealing gold and the dragon goes crazy. The other one is, it just left me. King George is fighting Fafnir, the dragon Fafnir. He's a talking dragon. And so Tolkien loved both stories and he put them together in Smaug, the dragon. So Smaug talks to Bilbo. You don't care about that. So let me see if I can show you this. So the point here is the serpent described by the staff is not a gardener snake, not a garden snake, a gardener snake, right? Not a little thing. You still freak out. I mean, if a gardener snake showed up in this sanctuary, right? Half of y'all turn into Pentecostals. You're getting on the pews, raising your hands, screaming and shouting in tongues. I guarantee it, right? What has happened is the staff is not being turned into a garter snake. It's being turned into something more ferocious. Let me see if I can show you this word. Psalm 74. You did divide the sea by your strength. You break the heads of, there's this word, dragons. It's this word, same word. Notice it's the dragon of the sea, which to the ancients is that's dangerous, right? You can't contain them. And the psalmist is saying, well, God can. God has. Psalm 91, you shall tread upon the lion and the adder. Here's a snake. The young lion and the dragon. Notice the connection between the serpent and the dragon. And you will trample under your feet. Now, where have I read about the crushing the head with a heel of a serpent? You think the psalmist is picking up on this language? Isaiah 27, in that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the sea dragon, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent. He shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. I think that word serpent is still dragon, but King James, don't quote me on that, but I think the King James are trying to use synonyms there. Jeremiah 51, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has devoured me. He has crushed me. I've read that language about crushing. He has made me an empty vessel. He has swallowed me up like a dragon. He's filled his belly with delegates. Finally, Ezekiel 29, this is significant. Speak and say, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now notice, he's talking about Pharaoh here, the great dragon. You see it in there? So what he's casting down here, it's more than a little gardener snake, but it's also in the literature, the Jewish literature. By the way, this is just a few. I gave you a dozen more. It's picking up this theme that God will exercise lordship over monsters, over dragons. And Pharaoh is nothing more than one of those. But who is it that is exercising lordship over the dragons, over the serpents? It is Moses who, go back up to verse 1, see, I have made you like God. You see, it is God, the Creator, who put the dragons in the sea. And he created, sustains, and is Lord over it. He said, Moses, you will go. You will be like God to Pharaoh. And so much so you'll have a prophet. So Moses was supposed to be that prophet. Right? Now he has Aaron. So you will be like God to him. And that you will exercise authority over the dragons. Isn't that wild? Now remember, Pharaoh has on his headdress a cobra. That's not a gardener snake. And here comes Moses. They see this staff? Watch what I'm going to do. Turns it into a staff. And they're all like, well, I can do that. Like, sure. Turn your little sticks into a snake and watch what happens. Mine's devoured yours. And he picks it up by the tail, which Moses had to do at the burning bush. And it turns back into a staff. I'm Lord over your dragons. I'm Lord over the serpent. This is just a taste, Pharaoh. If you harden your heart, it's going to get far worse. Because I am the king of the sea. I'm the king over the land. And what does God attack? The sea, the land, the wind, the cosmos. I just find that so fascinating. Regardless, you get magicians. They perform this miracle. By the way, you may find this interesting. Moses references these guys. In 2 Timothy, it says, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses. Now, you'll notice that you read through Exodus 7. They never show up. These names never show up. It's because they're not mentioned in the Exodus story. These names come from Jewish tradition. And so I think when you read this in the New Testament, I don't think that means their names are literally, historically, Jannes and Jambres. What I think Moses is doing is he's picking up on the literature common at this time. And so it just became known these guys were named this, and so they went ahead and Paul recognizes that tradition. And you'll find them among, I think Josephus mentions their name. The Talmud is most interesting. They tell the story that these two magicians left Egypt with the Jews. They were later instrumental in promoting the idolatry of the golden calf when Moses was up on the mountain. With that said, let's get to the plagues. And we got to move quicker than I would like to. The 10 plagues have multiple purposes we've already seen. They, first of all, demonstrate that God is Lord over the gods of Egypt. So let me give you two references here. Exodus 12, for I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, which is the 10th plague, and will strike down all the firstborn land of Egypt, both man and beast. Against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. Wait, I thought you're judging Pharaoh and his kingdom. Yes. But then you say you're judging the gods of Egypt. Yes, you did not separate those two in the ancient world. Likewise, in Numbers 33, while the Egyptians were burying all the firstborn whom the Lord has struck down among them, the Lord also executed judgment on their gods. This is very clear. These, of course, are acts of judgment. And it is not accidental there are 10 of them. 10 is an important number in the Bible. It is similar to the number 7. 7, of course, is a number of completion. 10 is a number of completion. We did this many moons ago. If it started for COVID, it's probably 8, 9, 20 years ago. But the numbers 7 and 10 are all over the place in Genesis 1 and 2. So certain phrases are repeated 10 times, certain phrases are repeated 7 times, for example. So let me show you how this works. In creation, there are 2 triads, right? I didn't put those up there. So there are 2 triads. That is, you get days 1, 2, 3, that's one triad. Day 4, 5, and 6, that's the other triad. We talked about this. Day 1 is light and darkness. Day 4 in the second triad is sun, moon, and stars, which rule day and night, right? Day 2 is the separating of the waters and the air, right? Day 5 in the second triad, right, that corresponds to it is the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, right? Day 3 is land, vegetation comes out of the ground. Day 6, which corresponds to it, is land animals and humans, right? So creation, you have 2 triads of 3. Now, in the 10 plagues, you get 3 triads of 3. And I'll show you how this breaks down, right? Plagues 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8, and 9. Okay? These are related, much like creation is. These are things I see. You can see how, not just that the Bible is an important book for our faith, it's a beautiful book. It's a work of art. It really is a masterpiece. So you're thinking, okay, so that's the way the math works out. Sure. In creation, you get 2 triads of 3 plus 1, day 7, which is separate from the others. Here you get 3 triads of 3 plus 1, day 10 is separate from the others. Yes, we get this. Day 7 is codified into Jewish law, the Sabbath rests. Here the 10th plague is codified into Jewish law, the Passover, right? We see these patterns throughout both. In the narrative, we are to pick this up. I'll give you just a few examples. First of all, the phrases of the first triad begins in the morning. So you can read the first plague, and Moses confronts Pharaoh in the morning. Here, I'll show it to you. Verse 15, go to Pharaoh in the morning. By the way, in the morning when he's out to the water, right, which is not an accident. He's out of water and he's about to turn it into blood. Those 2 phrases, the morning and the water, show up with the first 3, I think it's the first triad, first plague of the triads, right? So with the blood, the flies, and the hail, Moses will show up in the morning. He will show up at the water. Here's chapter 7. Here's chapter 8. The Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning, present to Pharaoh who goes out to the water, right? That is the plague of flies. And then in chapter 9, the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning, present yourself to Pharaoh, and say to him, thus says the Lord God, Hebrews, let my people go. And then you keep reading, he is at the water. It doesn't call it the Nile, it calls it the water. And that is the plague of hail, which is the 7th plague, which is significant because of number 7. The first plague of each triad also includes the phrase, so that you will know that I am the Lord. I didn't put those up here for sake of time. The second plague of each triad, these are the flies. These are the frogs, plagues, and locusts, I believe. Moses meets Pharaoh at his house. The third triad, so if you look at hail, locusts, and darkness, in this third triad, it ups the ante. Right? So you get in chapter 9, verse 18, behold, about this time tomorrow I will cause very heavy hail to fall, as never been seen in Egypt, right? You see how it ups the ante a little bit? In chapter 10, if you refuse to let my people go, tomorrow I'll bring locusts into your country. They will cover the face of the land, so much so you won't be able to see, right? And so what the hail didn't destroy, the locusts are going to come to destroy. By the way, it sounds like the book of Job, but never. The darkness, right, plagues all of Egypt except for Goshen, where the Israelites are. Now, it's ironic, isn't it, that the hail is beyond anything the Egyptians have seen. The locusts will be so great the Egyptians can't see. And by the 9th plague, it's darkness. They can't see at all, right? So what is the last thing they see is something they've never seen before, caused by 2 plagues that keeps them from being able to see. Right? It's beautiful. If you just break it down, I've never seen these things. Bible Project really helpful to me this week. By the way, the phrase in the 10 plagues, and you shall know the Lord is, or you shall know that I am Yahweh. Remember, Yahweh comes from the means I am, right? Exodus 3. That appears 7 times in the 10 plagues. Almost like it's on purpose. So the first plague, the Nile turned to blood, again, we got to move quickly, is an act of judgment. Remember that the Nile was a source of, was supposed to be a source of life for Egypt. If the Nile went dry, there would be no Egypt. And remember, because of the Nile, Joseph was able to provide for the nations. That's why it was a type of garden. Well, what did Pharaoh do with the Nile? It's supposed to be a source of life. He turned it into a source of death. He cast the innocents into the river. So what God is doing is he's returning the favor. You turned it into a sea of blood. I will literally turn it into a sea of blood. By the way, that language should sound familiar. Can you think of a story where murder is described as staining something with blood? It is Genesis 4. It's the story of Cain and Abel. His blood, the stain of his death, cries out to me from the ground. Here, what is it? The blood of the innocents is crying out from the sea to God. So the cursed is the land for Cain. Cursed now is the sea, the river, the Pharaoh. Right? So we are to see him as a type of Cain. We also see his lordship. We may have to cut some of this out. You can look at the 10 plagues and you can find how they are an attack on the various gods of Pharaoh. For example, Egypt worshiped the god of the Nile, even singing hymns to it. I've actually got the hymn here. I won't read it. Khnum was the guardian of the Nile. Hapi, I don't know, H-A-P-Y, was the spirit of the Nile. It was believed that the Nile was the bloodstream of Osiris, the god of the underworld. Both Neith and Thor were charged with protecting the fish of the Nile. That, of course, will come back later. And notice in chapter 7, verse 25, 7 full days passed after the Lord has struck the Nile. You think that's significant? You see the decreation language here? 7 days. So what was supposed to be a garden is now the opposite. That river of life has become a sea of death. Second is frogs, chapter 8, verses 1 to 15. Frogs is it's not a Hebrew word. It's actually a word borrowed from Aramaic, it seems like. I think, I'm not an expert on this, which is still a Canaanite tongue. Much like the word like baptism is not an English word, it's a Greek word. It's transliterated. So the word frogs here is borrowed, has no Hebrew origin. Now let me ask you this question. Now remember, we're looking for how this is a story of decreation. Are frogs animals of land or animals of water? Which one are they? Yes. Yes, right? All right. Now go back to the story of creation. Story of creation is all about distinction, male and female. Sorry, I just got kicked off Twitter. Male and female, right? Distinction, right? Land and sea, fish and birds, right? Everything's distinct. Day and night, everything's distinct. What is the second plague? It is an animal that is neither land or sea. Isn't that interesting? And so, in fact, notice verse 3, the Nile will swarm, it's chapter 8, the Nile will swarm with frogs. That word is used in the creation narrative. Genesis 1:20, God said, let the waters swarm with swarming living creatures. And the birds will fly, right? So now what's happening is these sea land creatures are swarming. Of course, frogs don't swarm, right? You know? But the word reminds us of the creation story. So they're just hopping around everywhere. So they will swarm the land, but they are also sea creatures, right? And once again, this is the superiority of God over the gods of Egypt. Heket, the wife of Canaan, was the god of fertility. Her symbol was the frog. Thirdly, the third plague, chapter 8, verse 16 to 19, is gnats. Some may translate this like mosquitoes. They seem to be little annoying bugs, flies. Not flies, those come later. In this plague, Moses and Aaron strike not the Nile, but the dust of the earth. And does that sound like creation story? What comes from the dust? It's mankind. And so from the dust come these gnats. You could translate them fleas or lice. You could translate them mosquitoes. So the source of man has now become the source of judgment upon man, the dust. Set was the god of the desert. There's maybe judgment on him. Geb was the god of the earth. Now notice the confession of the magicians in chapter 8, verse 19. This is the finger of Elohim, the finger of God. Yet Pharaoh would not repent. Chapter 8, verse 20 to 32 is the plague of flies. Again, this is an act of decreation. Just as image bearers were to feel the land, now you have flies feeling the land. And think about it. Humanity, when they feel the land, that is the language of life. Be fruitful, multiply. The blessings of God are tied to fruitfulness. What about flies? You grew up on a farm? Where do flies go? Where the cows were. Is that clear enough? And where there are a rotting carcass. Flies are attracted to death. So the language of life is now given to death. Much like the Nile was to be a source of life, is now being turned into a place of death. It's not an accident. It's decreation. Again, there are gods that are connected to this, but we won't spend forever on that. The fifth plague, chapter 9, is an actual plague. We use the word plague. They're not plagues. They're acts of judgment. There's one actual plague. And I think we all know what plague is after the last 2 years. There's one. It's the death of the livestock. It's the fifth plague. Notice chapter 9, verse 5. I had to read this a bunch of times when I came across it, and I couldn't find it. But now I hope you'll always see this. The Lord set a time, saying, tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. Now you think, well, that's an insignificant verse. Notice it again. The Lord set a time. That is the language he used on day one of creation. He set a time. It's the language of day and night. It points us back to God as creator, but here he's destructive. And what will come after the plagues will be constructive. There are many gods of Egypt who are depicted as domesticated animals. Perhaps the best known one is Hathor, which is the head of the cow. Of course, the cows were common imagery, so much so the Israelites will create a golden calf, right? I'll skip all that. 6 is the plague of boils. This word boil is a word play. Take the Hebrew word for serpent, nahash, like the serpent of the garden. Backwards, those letters makes the term boil. Now, we don't do this in English. usually, unless you're speaking pig Latin, and that just gets annoying, right? My kids are at the age where they find that if you take two words and you switch the first letter of the word, they think that's funny. They'll get over that until they become parents, right? And then it becomes annoying. So the one they like is Donald Trump, is Donald Trump, right? You know, they find that funny, you know. You do with that whatever you want. That's the best we have in English. In the Hebrew language, because most words are three letters, you don't have vowels, you can really play with the letters. And here, that may be what it is that you have going on here. It's interesting in chapter 9, verse 11, the boils were on the magicians as well as on all the Egyptians. Right? Seventh one is the hailstorm, significant. It's the number 7. This is the beginning of the third triad, and each of these are longer than the ones before it. The longest one is the 10th plague, of course, because it's like 3 chapters if you count the Passover. But, so for example, the second plague, there's one. The third plague is 4 verses. It's the gnats. The 7th plague is chapter 9, verse 13 to 35. I'll let you public school people try to do the math there. Now think about it. Hail is sending ice stones from the sky. Right? So you've had the sea as a source of judgment, the dust, the land, and now you have the sky. And this judgment of hail is echoed throughout the Bible. Let's not forget about what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. But perhaps the most notable one for us is Revelation 16. Now there's like 3 of these in Revelation. This is the one that may be most significant. Great hailstones, about 100 pounds each. That's massive. That is massive. Fell from heaven on the people, and they cursed God for the plague of the hail. Go back and read Revelation. It's clear John has been reading Exodus. A lot of those plagues mirror that of the Egyptian plagues. Nut was the goddess of the sky. Her name, when translated, is sky. Shu was an Egyptian god who was the personification of air. Both Seth and Isis were agricultural deities. Of course, hail destroys everything. The 8th plague is the plague of locusts. Again, this is an act of decreation. This is chapter 10. Again, it's 20 verses long, so I don't want to read all of it. So I will run these by you, and so it'll just be too quick. But verse 5, notice that the land is affected. Also, quote, every tree of yours that grows in the field. Verse 6 is the word earth. The word earth shows up all over the place in this plague. Verse 12, they would eat every plant in the land. Verse 13 references the wind. And in verse 15, it says, they covered the face of the whole land, so that the land was darkened, and they ate all the plants in the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Not a green thing remained, neither tree nor plant of the field, through all the land of Egypt. Now, why are those references so important? If you go back and read day 3 of creation, it references land, tree that bears fruit in the field, earth, because that's where the land was called earth. It references the land, the wind blowed, right? And the fruit, right? Everything bore fruit. It's day 3. Remember that day 3 is when the ground comes out of the sea and sprouts all the vegetation, and the land was called earth. So you can take that whole day, it's several verses long, and this is the opposite of it. The locusts come and undo an entire day of creation. Now there's another plague among the 10, or here the 9, that undoes one of the days of creation. Really, you could say it's 2 days of creation. And that, of course, is the 9th plague with darkness. It's obviously an inversion of day 1. In fact, look at chapter 10, verse 21. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand towards heaven, that there may be darkness. Did you see it? Go back to day 1 of creation. What does God say? And the Lord said, let there be light. Here, the announcement is the opposite. It's not an accident. The 10 days of judgment on Egypt are an inversion of the 7 days of creation that culminates in the garden. So what you're left with is Egypt, which was a source of life, has now been a source of judgment and death. Everything has just been ravished here. And of course, there are gods connected to here. The most notable one is Ra. One of the main gods is the sun god. And what does God do? He comes and he turns it off. Imagine that. Completely shuts it off. Except in the land of Goshen. Now remember what we read. It's in Exodus 12, Numbers 23, that these were an act of judgment, yes, upon Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but ultimately it was a judgment upon the supposed gods of Egypt. So God targets with each plague these gods. Oh, you worship this god over here that looks like a cow. You worship the god of agriculture. What if in an instant I took it all away? Now God, can God do that sort of stuff? Yeah, he did it 2 years ago. You remember we all had that day that we remember. It was in the news, and then we realized, oh, it's going to affect us here. And in an instant, everything shut down. God can do that. So much so he can turn out the lights. Now, what you're getting in secular science is they try to give natural explanations of this. And there may be some natural explanation. I don't know. But the one they favor is this volcano that goes off. And so the clouds come, and what follows them is locusts and plague and all this sort of stuff. And some of that may be true. I don't know. But I always tell people, let's say there is a natural explanation for the 10 plagues, okay? Much like there is a natural explanation why a lightning strike may hit my car that I didn't drive here. Lightning, that is a natural explanation. Lightning does strike cars every once in a while. And you would say that's not a miracle. That's just nature. And I would say you're true. But what if I said, tonight at 7:30, lightning's going to strike my car. And at 7:30 it does. Are you then going to say, well, that's just nature? You're going to think, it's nature. It's a little more than that. What is it you get here in the 10 plagues? It's an act of decreation. How does God create? God does not merely destroy. We're actually going to see this Sunday morning with the cleansing of the temple and the curse of the fig tree, the last miracle we'll look at until the resurrection. God doesn't merely destroy. That's what mobs do. God creates. And what does he do? That's what the 10th plague is all about. He brings Egypt to its knees by the execution of the firstborn child, which is exactly what Pharaoh tried to do to the Israelites. And God does it to Pharaoh. And then what does he do? He creates a new kingdom. And he puts them into a new land. And there, he blesses the nations. But first, he has to destroy this one, so that all the nations may know that he is Yahweh. Of course, there's a clear gospel connection in these first 9 plagues, isn't there? Jesus is born in a little town called Bethlehem. And his family has to flee. Why? Because there is a man like Pharaoh who is murdering innocents. And where does his family go? It goes to Egypt. So much so that Matthew sees the story. He says, that's odd. I've read this story before. After this new Pharaoh dies, after he comes under the judgment of God for hurting the innocent, he calls his son, quoting Hosea, out of Egypt, back to the promised land. And I've shown you this before, where he goes through the same story as Israel. He passes through the waters. He enters into the wilderness, not for 40 years, but for 40 days and 40 nights. He will climb a mountain and not only receive, but also deliver a new ethic for a new people. But first the ode must come crashing down. And it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God, where there is a land flowing with milk and honey. And it comes by the means of the cross. Moses dies on the eve of the promised land. Jesus dies, but he takes his life back up again. So Christ comes not merely to bring judgments, but to bring a new kingdom. That's the good news. Anything you guys have read in Exodus that sticks out to you? Other than the... we can do the story of circumcising Moses' son, but yeah, Danny.
It says here in chapter 9, chapter 8, all through these plagues, it brings out and illustrates very explicitly a principle that started back in Genesis, and that's the distinction between God's people and the other people in the earth.
Yeah.
It started with Seth and Cain, those two different lines. And then it says here in chapter 8, verse 22, it says, "In that day I will set apart the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, in order that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the land, and I will make a difference between my people and yours." Then the next chapter, he makes a difference between your animals and his animals.
That is a retelling of the story of Abraham. Who are the descendants of, or who's the ancestor of the Egyptian? We talked about this last week, Joseph. It's Ham. And Ham is the guy who brought shame upon Noah. The Israelites are the descendant of Shem. That's where we get the Semites, the Shemites. Now, in Joseph, that story was inverted, right? It was, anyways, you can go back last week. So, yeah, the distinction is between the Hamites and the Shemites. Again, God calls out a Shemite by the name of Abraham, and he blesses him in the wilderness. And out of that wilderness, he creates a garden. You're exactly right. Of course, the 7th, 8th, and 9th plague are very explicit. There's a distinction. So the sun is dark over there. It's not dark over here. The locust didn't consume our crops. It consumed yours.
This runs all the way through the Bible and all the way through Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Because it distinguishes between Israel, the church,
Yeah.
and the unbelievers, the unrighteous on the earth.
Yeah, so in Revelation, you get the 144,000. Yeah. Of course, I lean more towards preterism, so we're going to disagree with the 144,000, right? So anyways. Well, good deal. I love the book of Exodus. Yeah, Don.
Chapter 4, starting from verse 21, Moses is told all this is going to happen.
Yeah.
Really, I guess, glanced over that before. And
Yeah.
It's up to killing of the first.
Yeah. Carrie brought this up. The son language is used. Moses gets all the son language. Let my people go so that my son can worship me. Well, that language is very important. Seed language. And that goes to that. But read it as a father, right? Or as a mother. You could say, "Child, this is what's going to happen." "Okay, Daddy." And they completely forget everything you just said. And then it happens. You're like, "Why didn't you tell me this was going to happen like this?" Right? That's how I was reading this week. Like, he told him this. Yeah. Or I remember as a youth pastor, parents would complain, "How come they believe you and not me?" Right? Well, they believe me because they've heard you say it. So they do believe you. They just need verification. Now it's the opposite. Now I'm the parent, right? So, yeah, that is interesting. It tells them all that. It's a great passage. And then we'll do Passover, Lord willing, Sunday night, 10th plague, where the destroyer comes in, whatever he or she is, or it is, whatever. So I don't think that figure shows up anywhere else in the Bible. So a lot of mystery there. All right, how about we close out in prayer? And